Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes to allow people to join us this morning. So please bear with us for a couple of minutes. While we wait for more people to join, I will just do some housekeeping rules. So really just good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is the next in our webinar series, and this is all about understanding wood pasture and agroforestry today. My name is Jodie Davis. I'm the Regional Promotions Manager, and today I will be joined by Jim O'Neill, also from the Forestry Commission, Jeff Newman from Natural England, Nigel Pilling from Natural England, and also Matty Belfield from the Forestry Commission. Matty will be helping to control the stage, and they will come on as and when they're doing their presentation. You will be muted throughout the presentations, and we will come to questions at the end of all of the speakers. If you do have any questions as we go through, please feel free to use the Q&A box. It's just in the bar across the top of your screen. You should see a Q&A with a question mark in a speech bubble. If you could use that to pose any questions as we go through, as they pop into your mind, and we will come back to those at the end of the presentations. There may be quite a few questions, so if there's one you would really particularly like to see answered, please like that one, and we will prioritise those that we see have been liked by as many people. Just to let you know, it can take a little while once you've posed your question in the Q&A for it to then actually pop up in the box, so don't worry, your question will be there. It just may take a little while to show, so please don't kind of keep adding your question. We will have it. Just so you're aware, the webinar today will be recorded and we will send it out after the event. We'll also share the slides quite often. That's a question we get through, so we will be sharing the slides after the event also. Just so you know, as we run through, there is a short delay between slides. They are coming, please don't worry, and please bear with us while we switch over to speakers as well. But hopefully it will all run lovely and smoothly this morning. Hopefully everyone's joined, and I will start to pass over to Jim, who will introduce himself and will kickstart our webinar today. Thanks, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim O'Neill. I'm the Agroforestry Development Manager for the Forestry Commission. Much of my work at the moment is focused on working with DEFRA and other partners like Natural England on building the ELM grants. But in my spare time, I'm very happy to join calls like this to try and promote agroforestry as a new but ancient land use practice. I think there are many benefits that I'm sure we're going to talk about in more depth as we go through the morning. So I will scoot through some of this and hopefully you've got some questions and we can answer those later on in the call. So some assumptions and positions on agroforestry. We should consider it as a management system in its own right. It's not forestry, it's not farming, it's something else entirely. However, we in England have taken the position that agroforestry is primarily about introducing more trees, woodland and forestry into the farmed landscape, and the crucial word sentence there is to benefit the farming system, and that might be livestock and crop increased yields, but there are many other benefits as well. So if it's managed effectively, agroforestry can allow farms to become more efficient and increase overall outputs, at the same time delivering all the benefits that trees can bring, and environmental and management benefits such as carbon sequestration, soil conservation, water conservation, that sort of thing. Produce from the tree element can provide new additional products, and that can be fruit, nuts or quality timber. However, the objective might not always include produce from the trees. It might just simply be shade and shelter in certain situations. However, the forester in me always wants to know that we're at least considering productivity from the tree element of agroforestry, because I do believe there are significant possibilities that might be missed if you don't ask yourself those questions. Can we get more productivity from the trees? Next slide, please, Matty. Hey, get there eventually. So effective planning and management of agroforestry systems is absolutely key. Without this, you're not going to get the best out of your agroforestry venture. And we need to understand that management will be more complex using agroforestry. You will need an available workforce to work the system. You'll also need a market for the new products that you're growing, and you need to make sure that all those gel together. So don't just jump in without thinking about the effects and the outputs. So I believe, especially in the world climate that we're in at the moment, we've got a real opportunity for agroforestry to assist farms to combat climate change and rising prices, and making farms competitive still by increasing productivity and exploring new markets, and a big one, reducing costs. We should look at agroforestry as a range of types, from hedges with trees right through to small woodlands and everything in between, providing a whole spectrum of agroforestry throughout the whole different systems involved. And just a note, we'll talk about this later on, but forestry environmental impact assessment regulations can and will be relevant to some elements of agroforestry, depending on the density of tree planting. And I've gone through a number of slides following that sort of outline the different types of agroforestry we might be talking about. Next, please, Matty. Okay, so hedgerows with trees might be the ideal starting point for a farmer thinking about going into agroforestry. It allows farmers to introduce and increase tree numbers on the farm without giving up acreage, which might be attractive. And hedges can be just normal hedges with trees, greater numbers of trees, or you can design sort of wider hedges, sort of 5 metre wide windbreak hedges with a tree core and perhaps edible edges. Next, please, Matty. And on to grazing systems, agroforestry grazing systems. Now, these can be arranged irregularly or on regular grid-based systems, but the crucial thing here is it's careful management of the tree canopy and the grass sward. It's that interrelationship between the two that you're managing. And of course, if you're in Kent or in the southwest as you are, as opposed to myself in Cumbria, you might do the same thing and get very different results. So it's got to be a flexible system. You've got to manage it actively. So wood pasture and traditional orchards can also be a really good way of providing greater biodiversity into your system. And Nigel's going to cover that in greater depth later. Next, please, Matty. Alley designs generally associated with arable systems. However, they can be just as easily used for grazing and mixed rotation systems, so don't discount them, and it might make life a lot easier in terms of management. So again, you can be growing fruit, nuts, or timber trees. I believe a lot of people might consider this system rather than the more irregular systems, just purely because it's easier to manage, but we remain to see what comes in ELM. Next, please, Matty. Low density of individual field trees can be arranged in rows or scattered across the fields. Might just be a toe in the water for some farmers to consider more trees on the farm. Next, please, Matty. Riparian corridor, water buffers, ideally in a fence, so you've got rough vegetation, but they are as valuable, not just as valuable, they have a value if they're unfenced in terms of shade and shelter for watercourses. Next, please, Matty. Shelter belts. networks and small copses and field corners, all very relevant to agroforestry, and something that should be explored in greater depth, especially on those exposed hillside farms and that sort of thing. Next, please, Matty. So some pictorial examples of what we've just been talking about. So hedges with trees, and you can see that the lower picture there with a hedgerow with a red oak every 6 meters, which ran for about 3/4 of a mile. Great way of introducing shade and shelter for the arable field behind, without giving up any acreage. Next, please. So more dense woodland might be an ideal way to provide livestock shade and shelter. Okay, next, please. And here's my personal favourite. This is, you know, an ideal woodland I really like in Aberfeldy in Perthshire, where they're growing really good quality timber, and yet they're growing a good sward of grass for grazing underneath. And again, it's managing that interrelationship between the tree canopy and the grass sward. Next, please. Arable systems with timber, fruit, nuts, etc. You know, increased productivity overall. In East Anglia, this top photograph with apple trees and cereals has a land multiplier rate of 1.25 times the original crop yield from the same piece of land. So the crop yield, the cereal crop yield, remains at 100% because the benefits of the trees are bringing to the crop. So you're growing the same yield from a slightly smaller footprint of the crop, and then you've got the apple trees as the extra, if you like. Next, please. And wood pasture, I'll not go into this because I know Nigel's going to cover this in great detail, but again, a good way of introducing more trees and biodiversity in an agroforestry setting. Next, please. So to try and summarise a little, what can trees, woodland and forestry do to help the farmer do their day job? Providing options for an industry which is in transition at the moment, provides an opportunity for dialogue with the farming community on a new yet ancient approach. It also maintains the trust of the farming community on the direction of land use change. We're not trying to turn them into foresters or plant at their farms. We're trying to work with them to introduce trees, woodland and forestry to help them. There's 3 points coming up, Matty, if you want to click on those. So farmers, take advice, but you decide what's best for you. Consider how trees, woodland and forestry can play a part on your holding. So shade, shelter, soil, water, live weight gain, live birth rate increases, increased egg production, avoiding desiccation of crops, wildlife, timber, wood fuel, planning, screening, biosecurity, feed substitute, medicinal benefits, and so on. There are many, many benefits that agroforestry can bring. Next, please. If you just click on those, Matty, that'd be great. So what else you do on the farm? Diversification on the farm might well be aided by having trees. Public goods delivery, farmers should think about your own needs first. We will get the public goods from any tree planting you undertake. And just the message is, forestry or farming, it's been a very binary choice for generations, really. It doesn't have to be that binary choice. And there is a way and an opportunity to bring them together to benefit the farmers, livestock, crops, business, government, society, and the environment. And ELM agroforestry grants are planned for launch in 2024. So time now for planning. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Jeff Newman, who's the agroforestry lead for Natural England now. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, thanks for Jim's presentation. We often work together. So so we try and split the presentations accordingly. I work for Natural England, so we are interested in what biodiversity, what nature recovery can look like from agroforestry systems. But the one thing we say is that agroforestry is simply farming with trees. Next slide, please. So what can agroforestry deliver for nature? I believe in the wider landscape, it can provide a diverse habitat structure, make our landscapes more permeable for wildlife. It can have a direct benefit through priority habitats such as wood, pasture and parkland, which Nigel will take you through in a minute. And also there's nature-based solutions such as reducing diffuse water pollution and reducing ammonia in the landscape. Next, please. So there have been a number of studies on terms of what agroforestry does for biodiversity. There haven't been quite as many as you might think, and they do all point to the fact that biodiversity is something that can benefit from agroforestry. It very much depends on how it is done. One of the studies that Natural England have done in terms of woodland species is a report that's looked at woodland species, and it has found that a lot of those species are associated with edge habitat, with rides, with the sort of more open element of trees, and so it's hoped that agroforestry will mimic these systems. Next, please. So I think one report that's really useful to go to is the Trees Outside Woodland report that Woodland Trust did. They studied an area of the Eastern Claylands in Essex and Sussex, and they found that over 600,000 trees have been lost since the 1850s, which is a huge amount of trees. And agroforestry gives us that opportunity to put back those lost trees in the landscape. And if that seems like an awful lot of trees, well, they've broken it down to 17 trees per hectare. That is actually quite a manageable amount per hectare. And actually, if we look at it in smaller terms and break it down to bite-sized pieces, then it might be possible to replant those and hopefully exceed those numbers. Thank you. Next, please. So what do agroforestry systems look like? This is a picture from early 20th century in France, and it does show that there are an awful lot more trees in the landscape. It also does show there are a lot of lines of trees, and I think Jim and I have found that just because of the way that systems are farmed, lines of trees are going to be more easily managed in the landscape. You know, we'll wait to see what happens, but I think we do need to bear in mind that there may be some landscape impacts, and we have to be careful how we apply those. Next, please. And also, I think this is a slightly frivolous side, but really just sort of showing that if we've got lines of trees in intensively managed landscapes, what does it do? Is it just isolated lines of trees with no biodiversity benefit, or can they actually act as stepping stones in the landscape to enable biodiversity to transfer through those landscapes? I think the answer is it really depends on how we manage those systems. Next, please. So agroforestry needs to be productive for people in the first place, and then is it productive for wildlife? Well, I think there are a number of things we need to sort of look at in order to help us with that. And next, please. So I do see these systems as going between intensive and extensive landscapes, and one of the intensive landscapes that's been looked at are arable systems. Some work's been done by Tom Staton, and the implications for the practitioners were that the uncut flowering understories of the trees were a win-win for biodiversity, aphid suppression, pollinator attraction and farm income. So it is all about how the trees are managed, but it's also about how the understory is managed as well in terms of biodiversity. And I think that's something, layering those wildlife layers is really important when we're looking at biodiversity. Next, please. I've been working on catchment sensitive farming for a while, and we looked at a lot of, I looked at a lot of intensive dairy systems, and intensive dairy, by its very nature, means there is a lot of intensively managed grassland. And I've always thought it's really hard for those farmers to put any biodiversity back into the landscape. And then I visited a farm in Shropshire, which has some browse agroforestry, which he's found is really benefiting his livestock, but also is actually inadvertently providing some wildlife habitat for us as well. If you look at the lines of trees on the one side, you'll notice that there's a nice scrubby element to the understory there, and that's providing diverse habitat structure in an otherwise very intensive landscape, and it is actually an interesting case study to look at. So we will be doing some research on those systems to see what they can offer. Next, please. So I hope I'm showing that actually in the intensive landscape, trees can really make a difference. Looking at nature-based solutions, as they are called, trees, small shelter belts can act as really good mitigation for ammonia. There's some really good work that's been done with some chicken sheds looking at how we can reduce ammonia in the landscape that then protects our more special sites. And these shelter belts have been shown to, if they're designed correctly, to really reduce ammonia emissions. Next, please. The other interesting point is a lot of agroforestry has been sort of thought about and instigated within regenerative farming. And it's this sort of approach of stacking these different options together that can really benefit wildlife. This is a rather complex map of an estate where they're doing a lot of agroforestry, a lot of nut agroforestry, but they're also providing a lot of riparian buffers. They're providing pollen nectar strips, and together, all mixed together, actually it provides a lot for wildlife. Next, please. It's not just the lowlands that might benefit from these systems. Looking at upland wood pasture systems. This is Frith in Wales. Basically, it was quite intensively grazed sheep land. They've introduced cattle, and they have split those paddocks up using fruit and nut agroforestry strips. You can just about see on the one side, and then that has changed the vegetation across the site. So the introduction of trees and agroforestry here has actually changed the complexity of the habitat and changed the grazing system completely. And that shade and shelter has allowed that to be able to be implemented across this farm. Next, please. So we might be able to mimic our priority habitats. So priority habitats, what are priority habitats? I'll let Nigel introduce what a woodland, wood, pasture and parkland priority habitat is. But they're the habitats that provide most for wildlife and have been recognised as such, and are designated as such. So might it be that we're able to provide mimics of these habitats? I'm not looking in this instance to provide more of them, but more just mimicking those habitats to provide some of those wildlife benefits. And it might be possible that we could do that. I'm not suggesting we replace our priority habitats, but it's just a way of linking those habitats across the landscape. Next, please. So I'm traditional orchard specialist as well as doing agroforestry, and you'll see here a picture of a lovely old cherry orchard. It's really difficult to plant cherries now on these big vigorous rootstocks. It's really difficult to net the trees to stop the birds eating the fruit. There's no real productive element to it, and really it is a wildlife system, and we do pay for that under the schemes. But within that landscape, it might be interesting to put in some timber production for some cherry trees that will, using wild cherry, that might be able to provide a timber output, but also mimic some of those features that you get in a priority habitat in terms of structure and in terms of fruit and blossom. Might not be dead wood, so in actual fact, in that system, I would suggest putting in some permanent trees to provide that. So it would be a mixture of priority habitat and some timber that could be productive. It needs more exploration, and I wouldn't want these to replace our lovely old cherry orchards, but within that landscape, it might be a way of mimicking those. Next, please. Walnut orchards, I think we'll see a lot more walnut orchards. They're very extensive anyway in terms of the size trees, and I think walnuts are a really good cropping that actually can provide some decent productivity for the farm. I know there's a farm in Warwickshire that has a good percentage of its turnover from walnuts. Next, please. Cobnut plats, these are really restricted to Kent at the moment, but I know there's a lot of interest in these systems. And you'll see a very intensively managed cobnut plat. And then on the right hand side is a very extensively managed plat that actually would be classed as a priority habitat. It still produces a crop. It produces maybe slightly less because it's managed slightly differently. But you'll notice there's some actually woodland flora in amongst those trees. And in actual fact, if we just sort of take the gas off the productivity a little bit and release it for nature, we can still get a bit of both. Next. Wood meadows, so the combination of species-rich grassland with shrubs and trees can really add structure and insect habitat, which is really why wood pasture and parkland can be so beneficial in some ways. But these are systems that are limited, and we wouldn't want to be putting trees into priority habitats, into species-rich grasslands, but certainly mixing in the landscape with trees and shrubs can really help with the insect diversity on these sites. Thank you. Next. So I hope I've showed in a very short presentation that farming with trees can be very simple. It can be quite complex. It can occur in intensive landscapes and extensive landscapes, but whichever it's in, if we add those wildlife layers in, I really think we can get biodiversity benefits and nature recovery. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. I'll now hand back to Jim, I believe.
It's over to Nigel now. So Nigel,
thanks both. If I could have the first of my slides, please, Matty. It's just a
sorry,
delay.
Nigel. I should have explained you're the senior specialist for wood pasture and parkland in Natural England. So beg your pardon.
Thanks, Jim. No problem at all. So I'm going to talk now in some detail about wood pasture and parkland. This is perhaps the original agroforestry system. And we'll, if we could have the next slide, please, Matty. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the priority habitat is, how to recognise ancient veteran trees, what good might look like, a little bit about management creation, and then a little bit about what the schemes have got to offer. Next slide, please. So how do you recognise wood pasture and parkland? What is it? Typical features are open grown trees or pollarded trees, and where those trees are retained in perpetuity. So they're allowed to grow old, they're allowed to become ancient or veteran trees and develop that full range of interesting features that nature and wildlife love. There's usually a scrub mosaic in a mosaic with other open habitats, which ideally will be species-rich grasslands, but might be more improved grasslands, but where some structure is allowed to develop. And there's a history of deliberate large herbivore grazing. There might not be any large herbivores on the site at the current time, but you can see that history of deliberate grazing, large herbivore grazing, by the structure of those trees. Those trees have become open grown. You only find those sorts of open grown trees in areas which have got that history of more open habitat. Where trees grow up in a wood, as you all know, they'll grow straight and tall, and you don't have those lateral spreading branches which provide huge range of niches for many of our native species, native wildlife. As Jeff mentioned in his slide, there may also be a history of mowing of some of these areas, perhaps where animals have fallen out of use and they've perhaps been turned into wood meadows, and that can be an equally valuable habitat. Next slide, please. So wood pasture is an ancient land use. It's one where timber and wood materials, things like tree hay, or similar materials to what you might expect from coppice, has been brought from the land alongside pasture and the use of grazing animals. Wood pastures come in many different styles and types, enclosed or unenclosed, incorporating areas of coppice woodland management that might then have been grazed once the coppice has got away. We can think of wood pasture as being the management system or the structure that develops open grown trees and scrub in that mosaic, and perhaps parkland as the historic landscape which might be protected. But the priority habitat is wood pasture and parkland, and the reason it's wood pasture and parkland is because it's hard to separate those two areas. Parklands are simply open areas with grass or trees, but they're often protected in their own right as registered parks and gardens because of their how they've developed and their importance from an historic or landscape point of view. They've often developed from a medieval or Tudor landscape, and they've retained those significant populations of veteran and ancient trees that we find so important. They're really important for the really rare and specific species that we associate with wood pasture. I'm going to talk from a priority habitat point of view. We need to bear in mind that these are often very important landscapes. And so there may be a wide range of considerations that we need to think about when managing these habitats from an historic or landscape perspective, but I'm not going to cover that in this presentation. The sites that we're most interested in are those sites which have retained their ancient trees, those which have an ancient origin, so a long continuity of ancient and veteran trees and soils. Those are the sites we're most interested in from a management point of view. But wood pasture is a very powerful tool in delivering nature recovery because of the way the scrub and developing trees support a very wide range of invertebrate species and birds, and a wide range of our priority species are supported by wood pasture habitat. That's priority open habitat species and woodland species. Next slide, please, Matty. We'll talk a bit about these the ancient trees and these ancient habitats, and as I've just mentioned, the long continuity of trees and soils has led to that retention of exceptional biodiversity. So a whole range of invertebrate species and fungi and lichens that are only associated with these ancient habitats. We can find out whether these are ancient habitats we're dealing with by looking at the ancient woodland inventory. Ancient wood pasture and parkland is a type of ancient woodland, and it's often recorded as an ancient semi-natural woodland or planted ancient woodland on Magic. The ancient woodland inventory update, which Natural England is running at the moment, will add 2 new categories to the ancient woodland inventory. One is ancient wood pasture and parkland, and the other one is infilled ancient wood pasture and parkland. And these are the wood pasture versions of ancient semi-natural woodland and pores. That will enable you to look at that ancient woodland inventory and immediately see whether that's potentially an ancient wood pasture parkland site. But at the moment, they're in those 2 original categories. There's also wood pasture and parkland inventory that's available on Magic, and that will highlight areas that we know are wood pasture and parkland. However, the coverage of those of the layer isn't particularly isn't 100% complete. So one of the best ways is to use the Mark 1 eyeball and look for those open grown trees. There's also an ancient tree inventory that's gradually being updated and gradually covering more and more of the country. But again, we're probably only at about 10% completion, but it's a useful tool to use to spot those sites with open grown trees and veteran ancient trees. And then we can, of course, use the historic maps, early OS maps, tithe maps, estate maps could all give a clue to the genesis of those sites. Next slide, please. So what makes a tree ancient or veteran? We all know, don't we, when we see these fabulous trees in on our travels around the country. You know, many of us will have trees like this local to us that we know very well as individuals. These are significant trees of significant girth, which is the easiest sort of way to tell if a tree has a great age. Tree has experienced changes to its crown and trunk development as a result of that great age. So it's potentially died back in the upper areas of the canopy and retrenched or reorganized its crown and grown a new crown as its ability to move water and nutrients up into that crown has diminished. All of these ancient trees are veteran trees, but a veteran tree might not have that same great age, but it will still have those significant decay features and deadwood that are really important to supporting that invertebrate and fungal assemblages. Might also have a large girth and will have a high value for nature. Next slide, please. So here's a nice little drawing of some of those trees, showing some of those different veteran features or tree-related microhabitats that are really important in this habitat. And these are the sorts of trees that we want to try to gradually encourage as we create new wood pasture. So they're really important to look after these trees well, where they exist, and where they don't, we're trying to create this type of exceptional habitat. These trees, these habitats, these ancient trees and ancient habitats are defined as being irreplaceable from a planning point of view, and I'm sure we can see why. Next slide, please. So what does good look like? What might we be looking at in an ancient wood pasture and parkland? We've got veteran trees, open grown trees or pollards. We love to see these natural processes operating. There might be constraints on this from a historic point of view or landscape point of view, but where we can, we want to be using large herbivores to enable trees to regenerate. We want hydrology and those other processes to ideally have been renaturalized where possible. We want thorn and brambles and scrub developing that's enabling trees to regenerate naturally through those scrub mosaics. And we want to restore those historic landscape features and maintain them, and maintain those historic landscape views potentially within the parkland. So sometimes there's some management planning required to make sure that we can achieve both of these things, both biodiversity and historic landscape objectives that we might have on a site. Next slide, please. And this is how we might expect a new wood pasture and parkland to look, maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the line. We've got those flowering shrubs have developed, open crown trees are developing. We've got low intensity grazing enabling structure within that grassland, within those open habitats, and allowing plants to flower and set seed. But our habitats don't necessarily all look like that. Could I have the next slide, please, Matty? They may look like some of these ones. We might still be able to spot these open grown trees. We might be able to spot hawthorn, remnant scrub with open grown trees, areas that have been managed traditionally as wood pastures, but have had a long period with no tree recruitment. Or parklands where the land use has been turned over to arable or livestock rearing, and those trees are now marooned within those fields. There are a whole range of issues that we might need to consider when we're looking to manage those habitats. Next slide, please. At the other end of the spectrum, the land use might have changed, and there's no grazing happened. It's come out of arable use, agricultural use, and a new cohort of trees and shrubs have developed, but they've enveloped those ancient veteran trees. Unfortunately, woodlands are not a good place to grow old in if you're a tree, because as you start to reduce your upper crown density and you start to reorganize and try to grow a lower crown, those younger trees that are around you, they're able to fill in that space and overtake you. Your lower branches will die off. We'll all have seen this with trees that we've seen that have become surrounded by woodlands. Those trees start to fall apart. They're unable to sustain themselves, and that leads eventually to death of these ancient and veteran trees, which are so important. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through a few slides now to talk about key management of these sites. What are the things that we need to consider when we're managing these sites? And then I'm going to move on to creation of wood pasture. Many of these management things that I'm going to talk about, they're also applicable to the creation of new wood pasture and parkland. Next slide, please, Matty. So protection of existing trees, this is absolutely key. Many sites where we're looking to create new habitat won't have been wood pasture and parkland in the past. They might not have many ancient or veteran trees. They might just have a few mature trees, but those trees are a head start on the creation of that habitat. So any trees that we've got that are present on a site, we need to look after those trees. We want to try to get those to start to develop those veteran features if they haven't got them already, and if they are veteran or you know, fantastic. If we have ancient trees, we want to maintain those for as long as possible. We need to look after those trees by giving them a wide berth from any new tree planting that we do, for the reason I was just talking about recently. We need to minimise any damage from livestock that are either present on the site or we might wish to introduce. We need to reduce the use of, or prevent, stop the use of agricultural chemicals, which are likely to disrupt the fungal networks, which are essential to providing nutrients to those trees. Those trees interact with those mycorrhizae to enable them to extract nutrients, and when we apply agricultural fertilizers, it makes those fungal networks lazy, makes the trees lazy. They only select one or two fungal partners, where previously they may have had a very wide range. And in the short term, that might produce a boost. In the long term, it's likely to reduce tree health and prevent those trees becoming old. Next slide, please. We need to be thinking about, where are the trees that are going to replace those ancient and veteran trees? Have those trees got the same species? Have they got the same features that can provide the habitats for those important native species, those insects, and those fungal assemblages? We might need to use fast-growing species, particularly birch or cherry, to try and fill some of those cohort gaps. We might even look to some non-native species that might provide those gaps in the short term. Short term for wood pasture being, the next 200 or 300 years. If we have plenty of trees, plenty of mature trees, we might think about veteranization on some of those mature trees to start to create some of those features. So deliberate damage to those mature trees to enable them to develop the features that are going to support those important species assemblages. Next slide, please, Matty. We're going to want to establish more trees and scrub, ideally using natural processes, so that we're making the most of the genetic resources that are available on that site, and we're allowing the trees to adapt to the pressures that they're being faced. There's huge genetic variation in our native tree species. Where it's allowed to express itself, and natural processes are able to act on that resource, we're likely to get better adapted, more resilient habitats. We might look at some soil disruption, potentially some pigs. Might be some. We might replicate that with some ground disturbance with some machinery. Obviously, we need to be very careful from an archaeological point of view, and we need to be very careful with the use of pigs, because they quite often do things that you're not so keen on, as well as doing the things that you might be happy with. Scrub will establish in the presence of light cattle grazing or pigs, provided there's an available seed resource, and it will then protect those growing trees. So it'll do that effectively for free. Next slide, please. But that's not to say that some intervention isn't likely to be required, and that might be intervention to reset natural processes, to restore hydrology. It might be intervention to establish some tree resource, some seed resource in some of these landscapes where there are either very few trees or where some of the species that we might expect to be present have been lost, and so we might want to reintroduce those species. And there's a whole range of ways to do this. For our open grown trees, we're likely to want to use some single cages, but for our scrub mosaics, a dense planting with thorn and a few tree species within that might be a really good way to bring some of those species in. And there are options here where plastic's been used, and then there's some options here. This top left cage, untreated larch, no tree shelters, dense planting to give quick canopy closure in that small area to enable the trees to get away. And in the bottom right, you can see that's the second year after planting that cage. You can see the rate of growth on those some of those birch there, quickly getting away. Next slide, please. Just because you can't have too many pictures of tree cages, here are some other examples of the sorts of things that you might be looking for. Next slide, please. Livestock's going to be a key consideration, both in the management of existing habitat, but also in the creation of new habitat. We're looking for usually cattle grazing or pony grazing, because they're much less selective than sheep, so they won't go around nipping off all of the trees that we're trying to establish. They won't go nipping off all of the flower heads. Cattle create niches into which trees can seed. They take large mouthfuls of vegetation. They don't select for particular herbs, and so we get a much more interesting structural diversity of the grassland, but also it enhances the species diversity. There's a very good range of information available on grazing, both on the woodland grazing toolbox from Nature Scotland and on Woodland Wildlife Toolkit. Stocking densities, we're talking about very low stocking densities. In the uplands, we might be talking 1 cow for every 10 hectares or so. The lowlands, maybe 1 cow for every 2 to 5 hectares perhaps. And if we're talking about pigs, we're talking about 1 pig to tens of hectares. Very, very low levels of grazing to enable us to kickstart that regeneration process. Once we've got natural regeneration occurring, we might want to slow that down, in which case we might be able to then increase those stocking rates to reduce the rate of that succession, because we don't we want to have a nice scrub mosaic of a variety of different species and ages and densities. And that's perhaps the one place where sheep grazing might come into the equation, because they are so effective at halting or reversing natural succession. At that point, some targeted sheep grazing, usually in the autumn or winter, so they're not preventing flowering and setting seed. At that point, it might be appropriate to have some sheep grazing, but those occasions are going to be very limited. Next slide, please. Just finally, we might have veteran trees that need to be released from the canopy that's developed around them, and the way to go about this is to do it slowly. These interventions are likely to require quite long periods in between, so that you can monitor the tree, see how the tree reacts to the change in microclimate. The change particularly in moisture around the tree. Taking these trees down too quickly is likely to prevent that tree. The tree will still be growing leaves with large stomata, still be expecting to be in a moist microclimate. Suddenly you've taken all the trees down, it's not in that moist microclimate, and it loses too much moisture and dies. So we need the tree to be able to adapt to the changes that we're making. So we make those changes slowly. The tree then adapts its leaf structure and then survives the intervention, and then goes on to thrive because of this space and light that's been given to it. So I'm going to move now to talk a little bit about what might be available from a scheme's point of view in the current landscape. So if we could have the next slide, please, Matty. So this is a brief introduction to what is currently available under countryside stewardship. So this is the current scheme architecture. There are a range of different revenue options for wood pasture, both in the uplands and the lowlands. The upland rate has just been changed to match the lowland rates, so it's now the same rate for those options. There are two ways to pay for advice, that we can pay for advice for wood pasture and parkland, either maintenance or restoration or creation, and those are through an implementation plan, which provide a one-off payment of £1,200, or a feasibility study which provides 100% of actual costs, and the scale at which that plan is needed and the complexity of it will determine whether you might want to go for a PA1 or PA2, to use the jargon. Those payments are available all the time, so they're available now. You can apply for those at the moment. If you're thinking about going into a wood pasture option in the future, you can use those feasibility studies, implementation plans, and there's more information about all of those things on the gov.uk website, which you can find with a simple search on CS Grant Finder tool. Next slide, please, Matty. So just taking a brief look at the creation of wood pasture, so the WD6 and WD12, these are upland and lowland creation of wood pasture options. These options have got wide availability. They're available in a wide range of circumstances, and what we're looking to do here is extend, link or buffer existing habitats, so existing wildlife rich habitats. So it could be scrub, could be sites with open grown trees, wood pasture, other priority woodland habitats, and that's where we're targeting those areas. That's where, when you talk to your Natural England advisor, they're going to be most interested in receiving applications from, and ideally on sites that are large. The larger the sites you have, the better the habitat you can create, and the better the function of that habitat. And with the current scheme, we're looking for ideally sites greater than 50 hectares. That's not to say that we wouldn't accept applications for smaller sites, particularly where they're providing really good links or buffers. But the larger the area, the better that nature recovery is likely to be. As it says there, the use of this option for conversion of wood pasture and other types of woodland might be possible. As I mentioned earlier, wood pasture and parkland is a type of ancient woodland, so it doesn't currently have its own category on the ancient woodland inventory, but that is due to change. So because it says it's ancient woodland on the ancient woodland inventory, that doesn't mean it is closed canopy ancient woodland. That could include wood pasture. Similarly, with the woodland priority habitat inventory, that records all areas of trees over ½ hectare, greater than 20 metres width, and greater than 20% canopy cover, made up of predominantly native species. So if it's greater than 80% native species, that will be recorded as woodland priority habitat. That covers many wood pastures. Many wood pastures have areas of more dense tree cover, which would meet those criteria and are therefore on the PHI. But if you visit those sites, you can quite clearly see the open grown canopies. Those sites are often overlapped with wood pasture and parkland inventory. You can see that those are wood pasture sites. But where we have closed canopy woodland, particularly closed canopy ancient semi-natural woodland with a range of those ancient woodland indicator species, it's unlikely that we're going to be looking for conversion of those sites to wood pasture. Those are really high priority woodland sites, which are which contain those species which are adapted to those higher shade conditions. We're not going to be likely to convert those sites to wood pasture. But within the we would be interested in expanding or buffering those sites with creation of new wood pasture on the edge of those sites or around them, but it's likely those woodland areas will go into a woodland management option. Next slide, please. Final slide from me. What's available right now? Currently, feasibility studies and management plans are available to enable people to prepare for a future application. The mid-tier is open until the 18th of August, so the management of wood pasture is available through the mid-tier, provided that land is mapped as wood, pasture and parkland priority habitat. Landscape recovery applications are currently open for round 2, and again a quick search will bring up the information for that landscape recovery scheme. The higher tier scheme is currently closed, but, and this is fairly hot off the press from DEFRA blog, it is slated to reopen early next year. That's all the information that we have about the scheme for next year, and you can check out that source for yourself. Again, by googling that DEFRA blog. Sorry, all the search engines are available, and looking at that payment for upland farmers document. So that was a very quick trot through. If we go to the next slide, please. The wood, pasture and parkland priority habitat, and sort of things we might want to think about when creating or managing those habitats. So I'm now going to hand back to Jim, who's going to talk to us a little bit about forestry regulation and environmental impact assessment.
Thanks, Nigel. That was really good run through. Thank you. Learned a lot there. Any chance for next slide, please, Matty? There we go. Great. Right. Forestry regulation and agroforestry. As I've mentioned there, don't panic. This might look a bit bureaucratic and scary, but the key message which is going to come out throughout this short section is talk to people before, especially before, during and after if necessary. There simply isn't enough time, or you won't stay awake if I try and talk you through the whole of the environmental impact assessment regulations, but it will cover some of the main points. But yeah, it's complex, and you really need to speak to people about your particular application and how it looks within the regulation. So next slide, please, Matty. So forestry environmental impact assessment regulations, or EIA, will be relevant to agroforestry whenever projects reach woodland densities, and we'll come on to that in a short while. And basically we're looking at the following slides in relation to the EIA regs as administered by the Forestry Commission. However, there is other legislation, which is the agricultural regulation, which is administered by Natural England. You may stray into agricultural EIA territory with some elements of agroforestry. So again, it's very difficult to be specific, but I just want you to alert you all to the possibility of forestry EIA is more likely, agricultural EIA is potential. They're not always well known, and if in doubt, always speak to people, as I will say virtually every slide. Next, please, Matty. So what is woodland? And woodland can be existing woodland or woodland that you've just created. So woodland creation, it's not just existing. So there are lots of factors to consider that aren't immediately obvious to people, but some of the key factors are a woodland is classed as 0.5 hectares overall, generally 20 meters wide minimum, and covering 20% of the canopy that you cover. It covers 20% of the ground, and that is the potential to canopy cover. So if you're planting a tree, you have to project forward, what does that tree look like in 60 years time? How much canopy will that be shading out of the ground? So you have to project yourself forward to think, what will this look like in a number of years? And as you can see, that's why it starts getting a little bit muddy and imprecise, if you like. You've got to use your imagination to some degree. So the fact is, agroforestry could easily fall into the scope of the EIA forestry regs, but I would stress, don't let that put you off what you plan to do. It's simply a threshold, and it means you have to do something, but it's not a barrier. It shouldn't be treated as a barrier. You plan what you want to do for your farm, your land, your holding, whatever your requirements are. Try and stick to that plan, and deal with the various people you need to make that happen. Next, please. So just to explain why EIA is important, it's simply to safeguard features and species. So it's always prudent to explore before planting. These are the sort of headings that the Forestry Commission and private applicants applying for planting schemes consider as part of both the Forestry EIA headings and also the UK Forestry Standard headings. So biodiversity, climate change, historic environment, landscape, people, soil, water and wildfire. They're all things we need to consider in this changing world, and we do not want to plant agroforestry on some priority habitat or somewhere where there's an important species. That's why these protections are in place. And to some degree, lower density agroforestry shouldn't harm many of those features, but there may be situations where they might. So again, it's a bit of a movable feast that we need to explore with our stakeholders and partners. Next, please, Matty. So we're working with DEFRA and partners to clarify the position on agroforestry within the regulation, and ideally we'd have perhaps a new set of regulation in the future, but that'd be a way off. But where tree densities do stray over the forestry EIA threshold, we need to measure against those key measures that I mentioned in the last slide. However, we have pinned down the Forestry Commission regulations team with regard to agroforestry, and we've set a lower bar, if you like, in that anything over 44 and 51 trees, and that depends on how you arrange them. You can arrange them on a square grid or a triangular grid, and the triangular grid is essentially a bit more efficient in getting numbers of trees per hectare in. But the important measurement there is, provided you're planting trees no closer than 15 metres apart, you won't need a Forestry Commission. You won't need to talk to the Forestry Commission about Forestry EIA. And these figures might go into the Sustainable Farming Incentive, as just part of the ELM package coming, Environmental Land Management Package. So hopefully that will be an applicant-led process that you won't need to talk to anybody. There will be some perhaps geographical restrictions on where SFI goes, because there might be sensitive areas that we don't want people to just plant trees without advice and guidance. So that might be a restriction. But if it's not within the sensitive zone, you should be able to go ahead and do this. I mentioned alleys there as well, and alley cropping, alley rows, as long as they're no closer than 24 metres apart, that you can plant 3 metre spacing within the rows, of 5 or 10 or whatever it is you need. The important thing is that the rows don't become closer than 24 metres apart, to make sure that the canopies aren't closing and creating woodland. Next, please. So I mentioned earlier on in my last set of slides, we should be looking at agroforestry being represented by the whole range of types, from hedges through to small farm woodlands. And I would stress again, plan what you want to go through and go through the required processes to make that happen. It's really important that you have buy-in to what you're planning. So if your needs are a particular type of woodland and it falls above the threshold for EIA, don't let that make you change things, change your decisions and make compromises. Speak to the people you need to speak to make sure you do what you need to do to make what you need happen. Next, please. I'll just skip through these just to say, very likely there'll be no impact on hedgerow planting. There may be some impact on agriculture regulation, but I can't think of any. Jeff will jump in later if you think so. Next, please. Again, agroforestry grazing systems, you know, there is a potential there for forestry regulation to be considered once you get over a certain threshold. And in the case I've just mentioned, you're looking at 15 metre tree spacing or 44 or 51 trees per hectare, depending on the arrangement. Next, please. Again, alley designs, provided you're no closer than 24 metres apart, you don't need to bother the Forestry EIA regs, but if you're closer, then you might well have to. So again, speak to people. Next, please. And again, low densities in individual trees, very unlikely you're going to need to bother any environmental impact assessments regs. Next, please. Currently, we can plant riparian buffers in UCO, that's the England Woodland Creation Offer. And if you get over the threshold size of 0.5 hectare and 20 metres wide, you may well need an EIA, but if it's only down to 10 metres wide, it's unlikely. However, always best to talk to somebody, especially when you're planting alongside watercourses. Next, please. And shelter belts, again, I mentioned earlier on in the last slide, the better shelter belts are generally narrower and generally less effective for timber quality, but better for shelter quality. So with that in mind, if you're keeping under 20 metres wide then and half a hectare in size, then they will fly underneath the EIA radar. So again, you may well be fine without bothering the EIA regs. Next, please. So more ambitious woodland densities of planting. This is just an example. You know, you're definitely moving into EIA territory, so you do need to be speaking to someone. In this case, I just thought it was interesting. We saw this last week in Northern Ireland. These trees are 24 years old. They're 25 metre top height. They're planted at 15 metre spacing and 5 metre in the rows. So it just gives you an idea of the sort of growth rates that is possible with some agroforestry systems, and the reason why there is a need for consideration under EIA regulations. People generally don't like change, and we in the Forestry Commission are very used to dealing with objections quite often to tree planting, and you would think we were planting houses rather than growing trees in certain situations. But we have these regulations in place to try and manage the applications and make sure that we aren't planting trees in the wrong place and we're not disturbing or affecting species and habitat. Okay, next please. So again, message is talk to partners and stakeholders early in the process, and generally they will be here to help you realise your agroforestry plans. So don't be afraid, be open, be honest. The last thing you want to be doing is finding out right the way, 6 months down the process of planning, that you find out you need to do a forestry EIA determination or get a determination from the Forestry Commission. So book early, as they used to say. That's it. Thank you. I'll pass back over to Matty and to Joe.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. That was brilliant. I'm quite keen to just jump straight into the Q&A session. We are doing it on a priority kind of liked basis, so hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at them and kind of click the thumbs up if it's something you want to hear about. But we've got about 25, so we'll do our best to get through them. If there's any we don't cover, then we will include those in the information that we send out after the webinar. So let's just get straight into it. So the first question, what is your advice on how we can support farmers to plan for agroforestry schemes where there are currently no ELM parameters to plan against?
Very happy to jump in on that one. 2024 is not far away, and planning now is probably, you're probably going to be almost in the window of ELM grants for sort of delivering your thoughts on the ground, So I wouldn't worry too much. However, there are certain elements of agroforestry that we're wanting to support already in existence in both Countryside Stewardship and UCO, England Woodland Creation Offer. So you may well be able to do some of your agroforestry planting under those schemes. However, those schemes have specific rules, and they're not designed for agroforestry. So there might be restrictions on you know, if you wanted to plant agroforestry in the UK, for instance, there's a restriction on we can't use the land for agricultural activity. So what you could do is plant a more dense woodland that's fenced off from stock until such time as you can open it up when you're outside the scheme. Countryside stewardship, as Nigel just said, you know, wood, pasture and parkland is available in that now. UCO will support riparian corridor planting and shelter belt planting now. So there are options, but I would say make your plans. Don't let grants lead you at the moment, because I think you know, we're less than a year away of the intended launch of agroforestry under ELM, and hopefully there'll be something ready to apply for this time next year.
Thanks, Jim. On to the next question. You did just mention about grants, but the lack of current grants, apart from in community forest areas, is a significant barrier. Can you tell us more about the proposed ELMS grant support?
Yeah, again, I'll follow on there. The intention is that there will be a capital set of grants and a revenue set of grants. So it's capital for, you know, all the capital items and planting, and then a management style grant. And that might be available for existing agroforestry as well. We don't want the perverse situation where some people who've just done some agroforestry planting pull it all out again to make an application. So we want to make sure that they're covered and supported in some way. We're looking at an agroforestry creation plan as a prerequisite for the higher level of applications in what we're currently calling CS Plus, Countryside Stewardship Plus. And the SFI, which is the applicant-led end of the spectrum, will be much more simple and perhaps less ambitious, but there will be support for that as well, capital and revenue. Very difficult to be precise, and we certainly can't share some of the information at the moment that DEFRA are working on. But I can definitely report that the agroforestry team in DEFRA are very good. I've got a lot of faith in them, and we're all working together to try and deliver those for next year as planned.
Thank you, Jim. I think you may have answered this question, but if there's anything else to add, what is your advice on how we can support farmers to plan for agroforestry schemes when there are currently no ELM parameters to plan against?
Yeah, I think we've covered most of that. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Next question, will grants for agroforestry still come under Natural England or move under FC?
Probably both.
Oh, yeah.
Jeff, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it'd probably be both. It's a DEFRA-led scheme, don't forget. You know, so it's going to be sitting under the existing countryside stewardship that is run by RPA. And then when we are to bring in advice, then I think it will be a blended advice between FC and Natural England.
Logically, the more woody end of the agroforestry spectrum would probably fall to the Forestry Commission, and perhaps lower than that go to Natural England. But we're simply focused on designing the scheme at the moment, and we haven't divvied up who does what at the end of it yet.
Next question, what work is being done to identify the most resilient crops for agroforestry given climate change, especially with drier and hotter seasons?
Okay, I can definitely jump in here. Sorry, you can be bored with hearing my voice. Forest Research have a thing called environmental site classification for forestry. So it evaluates trees in their location and soil types to see how suitable they are for growth and yield. And within that system, there is a forecast of 2 climate change scenarios, which gives you an idea of how those trees might fare, you know, in 2 different scenarios. Forest Research are working now on an agroforestry version of that ESC, environmental site classification. So that will deliver the same thing. It will look at agroforestry tree species in an agroforestry setting in the same way as it does a forest setting, and it will project forward for 2 different climate scenarios. So hopefully you'll have that information. Not sure when that delivery date is, but they are working on it now.
Thanks, Jim. Thinking of potential damage to tree roots and arable alley systems, are there particular trees recommended for this, i.e. that cope better?
hesitate to jump in again. The photograph I showed earlier on of the apples and cereals was Stephen Briggs's farm in East Anglia, and he root trains the trees every year. So runs a subsoiler down the side of the trees, and that basically keeps the roots sort of pointing downwards, if you like. It sort of cuts off the fibrous roots and makes sure that the yield of the cereal crop isn't affected. So you do need to give a little bit of space. He's got 3-meter rows for the trees. So there's one row of trees in a 3-meter strip of ground, and he runs the subsoiler down that annually. There are other people who don't do that and just plant anyway. But it seems I've seen pictures of stumps that have been dug up where that subsoil has happened, and you can see a really good effective root growth that's just trained to reach lower down in the system. So hopefully that will answer that.
Thanks, Jim. Next question. In a grazed at 10 years system, is fencing necessary around trees at that age?
I think, can you hear me? We've got a heavy storm here at the moment, sorry. Yeah, I think it's possible to avoid, tree protection to a degree, but I think if you start introducing stock at 10 years, you've got to be very careful how you do that. And you've got to be careful what species you're using. I know from my experience with traditional orchards, you can have a mature orchard that hasn't been sheep grazed before, and they will eat the trees and be very effective at it. But there are certain studies that have been done, for example, that Shropshire sheep are better in tree systems. Yeah, I think it's just careful and slowly when you are introducing livestock to those systems. But it might be that you could reduce your fencing costs. But of course, if you're excluding stock for 10 years, then that is maybe a loss of income as well.
Thanks, Jeff.
I think the key is management of that stock. So having a fence, if you have fenced something like this behind me to get it established, I wouldn't rush to take the fence down, but I would use it as a management tool, so you can graze animals for a period and then remove them again. But as Jeff said, it is dependent on the tree species and the animal species you're grazing.
Thank you. Next one, are there any particular species of fruit or but trees that are recommended? I'm assuming that says nut.
Yeah, there's lots of people planting different types of fruit and nut trees. I think really the best places to look at are on forums, really, to look what's there. I think walnuts and cob nuts will be very popular. I think in terms of fruit cultivars, we're going to do a session at the Agroforestry show on the 6th and 7th of September, so please come along. Big advert for that, because we're going to be talking to commercial producers of fruit, and they're going to tell us the pitfalls of growing different types of cultivars, and they will also be sort of recommending different management regimes as well. So I think there's lots of things you can do. There's lots of potential. Research it well. What are your objectives? What's the purpose for the planting? And yeah, I mean, there is lots of potential, but hopefully there will be a lot of advice out there too.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question. Does creating wood pasture on existing pasture change the tax status of the land?
I can take that, but I'm afraid I can only take it to say that I don't know the answer to that question. We'll have to provide an answer.
Jeff and I are involved with DEFRA on looking at land classification with agroforestry per se, not necessarily just wood pasture. We are very aware that planting trees on land will have implications on land value, tax status, and perhaps tenant-landlord arrangements. So all these are being looked at, and our wish is that any agroforestry becomes a new agroforestry land use code. So it's identified specifically as agroforestry, and agroforestry will be an agricultural activity. That's our wish. Where we get to with that remains to be seen. But there is a definite, all those questions are definitely very visible and being looked at the moment with DEFRA legal. So we can't answer the question now, but we understand why you're asking the question and the potential implications implied.
Thank you, Jim. Next question. Do you know if the upcoming elms for wood pasture / agroforestry will be stackable with other systems, including biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality?
You want to take that, Jeff?
I think the ambition is to allow some stacking with those systems. It's just whether they're well enough developed for agroforestry yet or not, I would say, in terms of what their benefit is. I know they have been working on biodiversity net gain metrics on some agroforestry systems. Certainly for priority habitat traditional orchards, they are there. But how you use those is, I think, it's still under development, really. And nutrient neutrality, there is some work being done on nutrient neutrality and agroforestry. It's slightly different to woodland creation because you're still cropping in between, so it won't be as beneficial as that, but there will be opportunities, and there has been some papers on that, just trying to work out what the science says. I don't think we're there yet, but it is being looked at.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question. Are you expecting it to be possible for BNG and carbon credits to be sold from agroforestry systems?
Don't know about BNG, but there is an agroforestry carbon code being worked on now. So yes, the intention is that there will be something there for carbon sales.
Anyone know from the BNG perspective?
It's just under development still at the moment. As I said before, really, we're still looking at what metrics can be used. The problem is the systems are so varied. It's very difficult to sort of suggest what the biodiversity net gain will be from those systems. So it depends very much on how they're managed and how they're set up. But there is some work, I know, some work on an estate that is taking place with regard to that.
This is the FC's view on creating AF, say, wood pasture in existing youngish plantations.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Joe?
Yeah, what is the FC's view on creating AF, say, wood pasture in existing youngish plantations?
So converting a young plantation to wood pasture agroforestry. We're very open to discussing that. At the moment, conversion of existing woodland is quite controversial, especially more mature woodland, and that's something that Forestry Commission and Natural England will want to discuss in detail between them. So if you have any proposals, I would bring that forward. My intention is that for new agroforestry, if your ultimate purpose is to plant a plantation of woodland with the intention of opening it up for an agroforestry purpose later on, I think we should find a way to record that so that it is allowed, if you like, in the future. Otherwise, we'd have to go through the usual assessment, and the assessment at the moment is that provided the addition of livestock to a woodland is not detrimental, or in fact is beneficial to the woodland, then we might consider it. But I think with the express intention of planting a new woodland for agroforestry in the future, like this thing behind me, for instance, that's planted at high density without stock, with the intention of opening it up to stock, I believe we should be making a system to allow that sort of approach, because I think that really does combine forestry and farming, in its most productive guise, if you like.
Thank you, Jim. Will there be accompanying guidance on EIAs to allow for straight line tree planting in agroforestry systems?
Well, I think I mentioned before that some straight line planting at lower density will fly underneath the EIA radar, and that's not meant to try and avoid EIA. It's just simply there are thresholds where EIA comes into force, and we've just identified where that threshold is a bit more clearly in an agroforestry setting. If you want to do more tree planting, more more dense tree planting, then you would have to go through the EIA process, and that's where guidance and advice comes in, and some sort of discussion on the topic. So some lower density, less ambitious agroforestry will fly under the radar and some won't, but you will be involved in a discussion as to how appropriate that might be, through the EIA process. Sorry, it's not very clear.
It probably is worth mentioning that there are agricultural EIA regulations as well. So in cases where the low density planting is associated with, for example, semi-natural areas such as priority habitats, scheduled monuments, etc., it might be that that falls under an agricultural EIA, but it's going to be in those sort of protected landscapes, priority habitat, priority species kind of space. But it's worth mentioning that we are just working that through at the moment, what the implications are and what the guidance should be for that.
Jeff, that answers the next question, so we'll move on. You keep advising us to talk to people. Who is best to contact in the first instance, NE or FC?
Depends on what you're doing, but Jeff and I are work very closely together, because we, the grey area between woodland and agriculture is even more grey with agroforestry. So we make sure that we talk to each other virtually daily, really, to be honest. So I would like to think that whomever you pick up the phone to, you'll be including the other anyway. So, but if you have local contacts and it's regarding forestry EIA levels of planting, the obvious place to start with is Forestry Commission, because you might be moving into EIA territory, so you need a response from them anyway. And I would certainly hope that Forestry Commission locally would then involve Natural England as well in any discussions, especially where we're talking about wood pasture creation as well.
Thank you. Really liked the architect-drawn simple sketches used for the agroforestry slides. Are these being used in a guide by either FC or NE, useful for visual sharing info?
No plans to as yet, so but yeah, good comments. I mean, if people are, it's been the comments been made before, so simple diagrams are useful, I think. So it's something we should get them fed up by someone with some more ability, perhaps.
Yeah. Next question. My experience is that cattle and sheep don't like the grass that grows under trees, with it always staying much taller than the open pasture. Do you have any suggestions to get around this problem?
Jeff?
Yeah, it was interesting last week. We were on the Farm Woodland Forum last week in Northern Ireland, and we were looking at trees with grass, and we were looking at that issue. And Lindsay Wistance, who's done a lot of work on nutrition for animals, was saying that actually maybe it's needing better management of the stock under those systems. Might produce less sugar, but actually produce some really good proteins in those grasses. So actually, it might be that we need to manage those in sort of paddock systems to get the animals under there to get that nutrition. Depends how you manage the animals again, really. So it's down to that kind of manipulation of that management.
Thanks, Jeff. Last question, because we're then running out of time. Are you concerned people will do less and be less ambitious in order to fit it under the EIA regs due to the level of bureaucracy involved?
That is a danger, and that's why I was stressing in the last set of slides, try to stick to your guns and try to make happen what you want, and don't look at that as a barrier. Just look at it as a threshold you have to deal with in some way. I would say, most of the time you're going to get a favourable outcome. Yes, it's something you need to do, but don't let it sway you from your course. If your course is what your farm and your business needs and your animals or crops need, go for that and try and make that happen, and work with the stakeholders and the authorities to achieve that. But in reality, wherever there's a threshold, people will always look at them and make a decision. So yeah, to some degree, it will drive some perverse outcomes, I'm sure.
Great, thank you, Jim. I think I'm going to leave the questions there as we come to the end of the webinar session. We will try and answer any questions that we didn't get to today. As I said before, we will send out the slides and a recording of this webinar after the event. And also, if you want to find out about future webinars, we have a newsletter you can sign up to, and we include all of our events in there, and that will be included in the email that comes out as well. But just a massive thank you to everybody that's joined us this morning, and a really big thank you to our speakers Nigel, Jim and Jeff. So thank you very much everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely day. I hope that was useful. Thank you. Bye.